Why don't you give us a little introduction there?
Okay, good morning. It's John Gilkison, Aerostealth here. Today is Sunday, January 22nd, 2023. And we're trying something a little bit different this morning. Me and Joseph are going for a hike at La Cueva, and we thought we'd discuss this psychology of EV hating in a little more detail this morning while we're hiking. I'm going to ask Joseph to introduce himself and tell you about his what he does, his degree in psychology, and so forth.
All right, so my name is Joseph Yarock, and I'm friends with John Gilkison. We both have been strong advocates for adopting electric vehicles over a number of years, really. Both of us have plug-in vehicles. I have a 2017 Chevy Volt, which is a plug-in hybrid vehicle. It goes about 50 miles on a charge, and then the gas engine takes over. John has a, what year is that?
2019.
2019 Bolt with a B, which is fully electric. We've participated in various advocacy campaigns, with the city to try to get them to adopt electric vehicles. Not very successful, I have to admit, but at least they have a little bit of basic background now in the subject, and hopefully we'll get going with that. And so today we're going to talk about the psychology of EV hate. Just a little correction, it's not actually psychology, it's actually psychiatry. So difference being a clinical psychologist typically would have a PhD degree in psychology.
Okay, what's it mean when the screen goes dark?
It just is doing power saving.
Okay, good.
Okay?
Yeah.
So,
I thought that's okay.
right. Psychiatry, people get an MD degree, so you become a doctor, and then you do a residency in psychiatry. And the subject matter tends to be a little different, and the practice is a little different. But both fields introduce a fair amount of expertise in the way the mind works and how people think.
You work for?
Oh, I work for Ben Archer Health Center.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm a practicing psychiatrist. I see patients all day long, every day.
Okay, yeah, we needed to clarify that. So.
Okay, let's get going.
Okay, here you go. Do you want to keep on talking right now?
Well, I'll tell you what. Yeah, we should keep talking. I prepared some questions for you that you can refer to as we walk along.
Well, one of the first thoughts I had this morning, though, before we even started, was that really this subject we're discussing is a subset of global warming. I've been saying for a long time that we're all in denial about global warming to varying degrees. And so even though I believe in global warming and I want to reduce my carbon emissions, I still, just because of the way the world's structured, even though I have solar panels and drive an electric car and so forth, I still have carbon emissions, and I'm embedded in a society that is uses 3 or 4 times more, emits 3 or 4 times more carbon just to support me, so I can get food. I have highways and so forth. So we're all in some varying degrees in denial about climate change. And so EV hating is just one aspect of this. It's a subset. Okay?
Uh-huh.
So Joseph, what do you think about my first video on EV hating?
Well, first of all, I want to talk about the title. When I first saw the video, of course, the title comes up and, EV hate. And I thought, God, that's a mistake from a messaging standpoint, because hate makes it sound kind of contentious. But I think you did a nice job of clarifying that you're not necessarily talking about hate. Yeah, there are some people who have a very strong, hatred or antipathy toward
a bias.
Yeah, a bias.
I think that was one of my first points, was they don't really hate EVs, right. Particularly. They hate what they represent.
That's right, that's right. And you know, I think that's pretty valid. So I think in general you started off pretty well and did a nice job of clarifying your thinking and starting to identify some of the big issues that come up with electric vehicles psychologically. And those are all things that we're going to need to address, and hopefully we'll address. My guess is it's going to take at least a few videos to do it, though.
Yes. So do you think it is more than one kind of opposition to EVs? What do you think is the reason people are opposed to EVs?
Well, yeah, I do think there's more than one, and I think there are some people who are opposed because it's part of their political identity to oppose it. They sort of buy into the political messaging. You know, some of the more progressive politicians have proposed something called the Green New Deal, and there's been a huge media campaign on the right against that, and those people, I think, they may actually fall into the hatred group, and they may, at least at the present time, be beyond reach. We can't really necessarily communicate with them. But the people who are hesitant because they still need to learn more about them, I think those people can be reached, and I think we can speed up the adoption of electric vehicles just by helping people get a little more information.
We need to try to reach them, yes. As a side note here, Wyoming did not pass that resolution to ban EVs in 2035. But you know, the news media is not going to report on that. That bill was a fail.
Oh, really? I did not know that. That's
Yeah.
good news.
It is, but you won't hear it. They want to talk about the flashy thing that they want to ban them. They don't want to say that it didn't make it.
Well, right. As I recall, it wasn't really a ban because,
It was a resolution, that's all it was.
right, they I don't think they have the power to outright ban them, but they were going to discourage it officially. And I don't know. Did you see anything about the opposition? Why it failed?
No, nothing. I just know it didn't make it. And it was it was a stunt to tweak the nose of the liberals. That's all it really was. So, okay, next question. What keeps people from wanting to know more about EVs?
Well, that's an interesting question because, of course, it varies from person to person. But a lot of people, go through lives being kind of stressed, having to make decisions, having to struggle with technology they don't really understand. And it's a daily frustration for them. And the last thing they want to do is take on another frustration.
You want me to hold that camera for a while, maybe?
Yeah, sure.
I can get you in the picture. Go ahead. You go ahead of me a little bit.
Okay. So I think that, and this is something I've observed clinically. People are just very stressed, having to make decisions, having to learn new things, and getting frustrated. And so they try to chart their lives in a way that minimizes those frustrations, which, is sensible sort of on a day-to-day basis, but in terms of plotting out your life long term, you really want to be a little bit more forward thinking. And it's a problem for people. I think there are some people who are not quite so stressed in life that have arranged their lives in such a way that it's working for them. And they like that. They like the peace of mind. And they just don't want to have to make any major changes. I think there's a third group of people who've kind of bought into the propaganda. They have begun to think about electric vehicles, but because of the media campaign against them, they run into what I call a cognitive stop sign and say, okay, I don't need to pursue this any further. I know all I need to know. I'm not going to get an EV.
Okay. I would add to that, I think there's some people are more naturally curious than other people about new things. We've talked before about how the human mind forms initial impressions based on emotion before they even start thinking logically about something. Why is that?
Well, that's a good question. And the question of why, I think, is inherently a difficult question. Aristotle said there are 8 different ways to answer the question why, and when I was in high school I memorized that list of 8 things, but I can't recall it now. In any case, if you look at it from a neurobiological standpoint, evolutionary standpoint, we look at how brains developed over the course of evolution, and early on a capacity for emotion developed, and it was only later on that a capacity to think logically developed, and thus the emotional circuits are more primal and they operate first, and there probably isn't really any way around that.
That's a good point. Built in.
Yeah, it's built in. It's just the way the brain's wired.
Yeah. Well, the next question's one I'm most interested in. Why do you suppose people tend to dismiss scientific findings?
Well, okay, again, that's a really complicated subject, but again, your brain is wired to value your personal experience over anything else that you're told. And over the course of people's lives, they quite often run into scientific findings that seem to contradict their personal experience, and so they develop a habit of suspicion and dismissiveness. The other thing is that many people are taught that scientific findings contradict their religious beliefs. And of course, people write books about that. It's a very complicated subject. But if people have to accept science, it does confront them with some intriguing philosophical and theological questions. Of course, the essence of religion is that you accept things on faith, and that your fate depends on your faith. So anything that seems to challenge that is going to be a non-starter.
I'll give you an example of that. I have an exchange with a fellow on YouTube about, he's saying that studies have shown there's really not enough materials to make batteries long term. In other words, we can't replace the whole worldwide fleet. And I told him I would be a little suspicious of that, because there were studies back in the 1920s that said we wouldn't have enough gasoline for cars. And finally I told him I was having a Rumsfeldian moment.
Right, exactly.
About unknown unknowns. In other words, we don't know what future technology is, battery technology is going to develop and so forth. So,
yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there are always going to be things you don't know. And
besides that, I said predicting the future, I started calling it being a Nostradamus.
Right.
Instead of Nostradamus.
Yeah.
So, conversation kind of trailed off after that.
Yeah, I'm afraid so.
He denied it, though. He said these studies are valid, and they are probably until we have a new study.
Yeah, well, there's no technology that's going to be perfect or work forever. I mean, that's just the way it is.
All right, let me see here. Stop a minute.
Yeah.
You mentioned that people thinking are susceptible to anchoring bias. What is anchoring bias?
Excellent question. So, starting out with just a discussion of bias in general, when people engage in a thought process, they tend to veer off in one direction or another based on the state of mind that they have at the time, but also based on their habitual thinking patterns. And many of these biases, I should note, actually serve a purpose, because surviving in the wild requires that you be able to think and act reasonably quickly in many situations. So the design of the brain is such that there are certain shortcuts. Now, that can be good, but it can also be bad, okay? It can work for you. You know, for example, here we are hiking, you know, at the base of the Oregon Mountains. There are mountain lions in those mountains. It is remotely possible we could encounter a mountain lion. And if that happens, we don't want to be thinking about the physics problem of what direction to run in, how fast to run, and so on and so forth. We just want to run, right? So
Yeah. Two different ways, supposedly.
that's right. And that, yeah, give the lion something to think about and pause. So those are useful things. And so it's not like it's a design flaw. And it's not as though you can fault people for having these biases. They actually serve a purpose. The problem is that as the world changes, things that served a purpose before can start to work against you. And that's exactly what's happening here.
One of the original things you said about this to me was that people form opinions on an initial fact, which later, even if they find out it's true, proven to be false, they've become anchored to because that's what their opinion's formed on.
That's right. That's right. It's absolutely true. And you can see this.
One of the reasons we have to slow down, I need breath to answer the questions.
Okay.
Or I ask the questions, I'm sorry. You see what's happening to me here.
Okay. Yeah, so just point the camera at me, please, and
I'm doing that.
I'll try. Okay, great. So anchoring bias is exactly that people start out with an initial thought that then continues to influence their chain of thinking as they go from one thought to another and try to engage in kind of a logical process. At certain decision points, they have a choice of going one way or the other. And the first thought that they have at the start of that thinking process tends to influence which direction they go subsequently. That's what anchoring bias is.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Fossil fuel company propaganda is a classic FUD campaign. That stands for fear, uncertainty, and doubt. You mentioned that the one way we trick people is by using psychological methods called framing. What is framing?
Okay, great question. So that builds on the notion of anchoring bias. So when you engage in framing, you start the discussion with a statement that favors your position, both logically and emotionally. And of course, one of the challenges with communication is that when we're talking, there's a literal meaning to what we say, but there's also an emotional content. There's no way around that. And someone who's good at framing will choose words that evoke certain emotions, and those emotions, once evoked, will tend to influence the subsequent train of a person's thinking.
That's one of the things I've noticed about the Republicans in general, is they're good at framing the language. And the language is what the liberals go ahead and they get on their heels and they pick up the very same language to try to debate the Republicans instead of framing the debate in their own language. And that's not good.
Right, because you're always on the defensive.
Yes. Okay. Well, we're actually at the last question. So in my most recent video, I talked about how people identify with their cars and perceive a challenge to their choice of cars as a personal attack on their identity. Do you agree with that? And if so, how does that work?
Okay. So, yeah, I do agree with that. Actually, I agree with it, and I think it's a critical point in this discussion that another source of bias in people's thinking occurs if they feel that they're being attacked. And often, for example, if you're talking to somebody innocently about your experience with electric cars, you may not even realize that they feel as though you're attacking their identity. And I think you've had experiences like that, and I think,
I have.
yeah, with your brother about electric fire trucks. But at some point I'll let you elaborate on that if you haven't already. But that's a great example of it. And it's a little bit unclear as to exactly what's happening here, but the best models that I've been able to find in the studies that have been done suggest that a person's sense of self is not really rooted in their biological self. It's rooted in a combination.
Use this as a background. Go
Okay,
ahead.
great.
Right there. You can stop there and turn right.
All right. So it's rooted in a combination of their biological self, their social self, okay, and then their psychological self, which is a sense of who I am, what I like, how I feel, and how I interact with the world. So people have a view of themselves, which I call the self view, but other people don't use that term, I made it up. But it's self-identity or self-image, I think is more commonly used. And then people have a worldview. And they go through lives trying to align those two so that their life works for them. You know, for example, part of my worldview is that it's good to work for a living and save for retirement. And then part of my self-view is, okay, I'm a guy who gets up and gets to work on time every day. I go there when I'm supposed to be there. I work constantly until it's time to go home. So my self-image correlates with my worldview. And I do things for the rest of the world does things for me. Okay.
Yeah. Well, that is the last question, so I think we really need to stop the video here. We need to get you a handle like Aerostealth, a psycho therapist,
Right.
a psycho the rapist or something. Right. I'm kidding.
I know, but believe me, I've seen that happen in the early days of computers, that the word would be split before word processors, and you would sometimes see that the word therapist would be truncated at the E, so it would say the, and then the next line, rapist, which is extremely unfortunate. Okay.
Yeah, there was a cartoon about that. That's why I bring it up.
Okay, but yeah, I'll think about that and come up with something that's acceptable.
Oh, right? Okay. I'm going to let you turn it off.
Okay, great.
It's your tech.
All right, so let's do one.
I think we did good.
Last
we
pan
did.
Showing the area here. And hopefully help people understand why we're such advocates of nature and preserving nature. It's because nature is so wonderful.
And that was his ugly co-anchor right there.
All right. Signing off.